Hey guys, it's Les from Hardcore Pawn. Do you know what holiday's coming up? Yes.
Yes. Remember Les Gold from Hardcore Pawn. The foreclosure notice was printed on bright yellow paper, impossible to miss against the grimy Detroit snow. Les Gold stood on 8 Mile Road, staring at his own storefront, the words "Sheriff's Sale" screaming from every window, and felt something inside him collapse like a building imploding in slow motion. 40 years of grinding, hustling, building an empire from nothing, gone in 72 hours. The temperature that January morning was 9 degrees, but Les barely felt it. He felt numb as the Wayne County Sheriff's Department prepared to seize and sell American Jewelry and Loan, the store that had made him famous, put his family on television, and defined his identity since before his children were born. The crowd outside told him this would be worse than he imagined. Former employees, creditors he had been dodging, reporters ready to film his humiliation, customers clutching pawn tickets for items trapped in legal limbo. "How does it feel to lose everything?" a reporter shouted. What had happened? How had reality TV success turned into bankruptcy court? Inside, the silence felt heavier than the crowd. Display cases sat nearly empty. Walls showed pale outlines, where guitars and jewelry once hung. Even the neon sign bore a sheriff's sticker marking it for auction. Seth waited in the back office, exhaustion etched across his face. Ashley stood in the doorway, makeup perfect, eyes red. "They're taking everything, Dad. We can fight," Les said automatically. "With what money?" Seth snapped. There was nothing left. The collapse hadn't happened overnight. It had begun 18 months earlier with a smooth-talking financial innovation consultant pitching cryptocurrency-backed loans. "The future is digital," he had said. Les invested $2 million, then mortgaged the building for 3 more, then leveraged his house and everything he owned. The crypto market crashed 6 months later, an implosion that wiped out 80% overnight. Customers defaulted, leaving him holding worthless digital tokens while still owing millions to banks. "It'll recover," Les insisted. But waiting required money he didn't have. The traditional pawn business deteriorated, inventory thinned, paychecks bounced. Then came the viral video. A customer claiming her grandmother's ring was worth $12,000 after Les had offered $20,000. The video exploded. Lawsuits followed. Customers stopped coming. Banks called their loans. Seth begged him to settle. Ashley pleaded with him to modernize. Les refused. He doubled down, fought the lawsuit, poured money into legal fees, convinced the market would rebound and vindicate him. By the time he admitted catastrophic mistakes, it was too late. The venture collapsed completely. Creditors circled. Debts mounted to $7 million personally, over $19 million total liabilities. The family meeting was worse than any foreclosure notice. Lily's voice trembled with exhaustion. "We owe $7 million." Ashley admitted she would have to declare bankruptcy because she had co-signed loans. Seth said he was leaving Detroit. "You can't fix this," Lily told him. "You can only survive it." The auction came on a bitter Friday morning. The neon sign sold first. The building went for barely a quarter of its value. Sheriff's deputies escorted the Pawn King from his kingdom, while cameras captured every moment. The video went viral. Commentators called it karma, hubris, a reckoning. At the bankruptcy hearing, the trustee summarized it brutally. Liabilities of $19.4 million, assets of $800,000, deficiency of $18.6 million. At 73, no prospect of meaningful income. To avoid prison over disputed crypto dealings, Les agreed to a payment plan, consuming every dollar beyond basic living expenses for the rest of his life. Work until death. No assets. No inheritance for his children. 3 months later, Les Gold worked as a clerk at a discount electronics store, making $12 an hour, living in a small studio apartment. Seth had moved to Chicago. Ashley was rebuilding her life. Lily filed for divorce. American Jewelry and Loan reopened under new ownership, his name erased. Driving past 8 Mile Road one evening, Les saw strangers doing business where his empire once stood. He didn't stop. He had lost everything: money, property, reputation, identity. He understood that confidence without wisdom is just arrogance, waiting to be punished, that success without humility is temporary, and that the higher you climb, the farther and harder you fall. And Les, working his shifts and paying his debts, lived the remainder of his life in the shadow of what he had been, knowing he had gambled everything on his own infallibility and lost. But the story didn't end with the auction. It didn't end with bankruptcy papers stamped and filed. It didn't even end with the humiliation of being escorted out by sheriff's deputies while cameras rolled. Because the hardest part wasn't losing the money. It wasn't losing the building on 8 Mile. It wasn't even losing the television fame. It was waking up every morning knowing he had destroyed his own legacy. The first week at the electronics store, Les kept his head down. He stocked shelves. He rang up customers buying discounted headphones and refurbished laptops. No one called him boss. No one asked for his appraisal. No one cared about his opinion. At 73 years old, the man who once negotiated 6-figure deals was explaining return policies for $29.99 speakers. Every paycheck hurt. Not because it was small, but because almost all of it vanished instantly. Garnished, redirected, swallowed by debt. He kept just enough to survive. Rent, utilities. Basic. Groceries, nothing more. At night, alone in his apartment, the silence was louder than the crowds had been. No television crew, no family arguments echoing down hallways, no neon glow from the store sign outside his office window. Just regret. He replayed every warning. He ignored. Seth telling him to slow down. Ashley asking him to modernize. Lily begging him to stop gambling the future on pride. He had thought leadership meant never backing down. He had thought strength meant never admitting fear. He had confused stubbornness with confidence. Meanwhile, Detroit moved on. The pawn shop under new ownership thrived. Fresh paint, new signage, younger staff, digital systems. Customers returned. Not because of nostalgia, but because business adapts or it dies. Les watched from a distance. One afternoon, a former customer recognized him in the electronics store. The look wasn't angry. It wasn't mocking. It was worse. It was pity. "That used to be your place, right?" the man asked quietly. Les nodded. "Shame," the man said, and walked away. That word followed him for weeks. Shame. Not for losing money, not for failing publicly, but for dragging his family down with him. He tried calling Seth once. The number had changed. He typed Ashley's name into his phone and stared at it for 10 minutes before putting the device down. What could he say that wasn't already too late? Time moved forward the way it always does, indifferent to pride, blind to reputation. Months turned into a year. The debts barely shrank. The payments felt symbolic against numbers that large. But he kept working, because that was the deal. Work until death. Sometimes customers would complain about prices, and Les would feel the old instinct rise, the sharp retort, the dominance, the need to win the exchange. But he swallowed it. Winning had cost him everything before. One evening, as he locked up the store, snow falling softly over Warren, Michigan, he realized something painful but honest. Survival is quieter than success. There are no cameras, no applause, no headlines, just endurance. Les Gold had once believed being the king of porn made him untouchable. Now he understood something far harsher. No empire is immune to ego. No reputation survives arrogance unchecked. And no amount of past success protects you from present mistakes. He wasn't rebuilding an empire anymore. He was rebuilding humility. Slowly, silently, alone. Years passed, and the headlines faded. The viral clips stopped circulating. The commentary moved on to new scandals, new collapses, new cautionary tales. In the fast-moving world of media, even, public disgrace has an expiration date. But for Les, the consequences didn't expire. They compounded quietly, month after month. His routine became mechanical. Wake up, coffee, bus ride, 8-hour shift, garnished paycheck. Repeat. He stopped checking the exact debt balance. The number was too large to emotionally process. What mattered was that it still existed, and always would. The agreement he signed meant there would be no clean slate, no dramatic comeback, no redemption arc with swelling music and a final triumphant scene. Just obligation. Sometimes younger co-workers would talk about investments, crypto surges, stock picks, can't miss opportunities. He would feel a flicker of something between anger and shame. He wanted to interrupt, to warn them how quickly the future can collapse. But he didn't. No one asks the cautionary tale for advice. On his 75th birthday, there was no party, no family dinner. Just a generic card from the store manager and a cupcake someone left in the break room. He sat alone that evening and thought about the version of himself from 5 years earlier. The confident man convinced he was. Evolving ahead of the industry. He hadn't been evolving. He had been panicking. The hardest truth wasn't that he made a bad investment. It was that he made it out of fear. Fear of becoming irrelevant. Fear of aging out. Fear of being replaced. Pride had masked insecurity. And insecurity had driven risk disguised as vision. One cold afternoon, nearly 2 years after the foreclosure, Les finally gathered the courage to drive back to Ada Mile and walk inside the pawn shop that used to bear his name. No cameras, no announcement, just an old man pushing open a familiar door. The layout was different. Cleaner, brighter, digital price displays. Younger staff moving efficiently behind modern counters. The neon sign was gone, replaced by a sleek LED logo. For a moment, he felt invisible. Then one employee looked at him curiously. "Can I help you, sir?" "Sir, not Mr. Gold, not boss, not king, just sir." "I was just looking," Les said quietly. He walked past the display cases, noticing how organized everything was. Transparent pricing, clear policies, systems designed to prevent exactly the chaos he had allowed to fester. It hurt, but it also clarified something. The business hadn't failed because the industry died. It failed because he stopped adapting wisely and started reacting emotionally. As he turned to leave, he caught his reflection in the glass of a display case. Older, smaller, no entourage, no authority, but also, strangely, lighter. Because there was nothing left to protect. Outside, the Detroit wind cut through his coat. He didn't linger. He didn't try to reclaim anything. He understood now that some chapters close permanently. That night, sitting in his apartment, he wrote something on a notepad for the first time in years. Not a deal, not a loan structure, not an expansion idea, just a sentence. Success built on ego collapses under pressure. He left the note on the kitchen table. Les Gold would never rebuild his empire. He would never clear the full debt. He would never regain the reputation he once carried like armor. But he could finish differently than he failed. Quietly, responsibly, without excuses. And in the final stretch of his life, that would have to be enough. The years continued to move in one direction, forward, whether he was ready or not. By 77, Les no longer worked full retail shifts. His knees couldn't handle the long hours standing, and his back reminded him daily that time always collects its debt. He transferred to part-time inventory work in the stock room. Fewer customers, fewer conversations, less exposure. In some ways, it suited him. The man who once thrived on confrontation and negotiation now preferred quiet tasks, counting boxes, logging serial numbers, organizing shipments. There was something humbling about physical work that required no ego, only consistency. The debt still loomed. Every month, the payment siphoned away anything beyond survival. The number barely moved. It didn't matter. He had stopped measuring progress by the balance sheet. He measured it by restraint. When frustration rose, he swallowed it. When regret surfaced, he faced it. When blame tempted him, he rejected it. That was new. One afternoon, unexpectedly, Ashley called. The number lit up his phone, and for a moment he thought he was imagining it. His hands trembled before he answered. "Hi, Dad." Her voice was steadier than he remembered. Older somehow. Not angry, just cautious. They didn't talk about money. They didn't rehash the collapse. She told him she had finished her classes. She had rebuilt her credit slowly. She was managing a small business now, not in pawn, not in anything connected to the past. "I did it the slow way," she said. No shortcuts. The words weren't an attack. They were a boundary. "I'm proud of you," Les replied, and he meant it without defensiveness, without trying to attach himself to her success. There was no dramatic reconciliation, no tears. But the call lasted 23 minutes. It was more than he expected to ever receive again. Seth took longer, years longer. Their first interaction was a brief message, formal, distant. Eventually, a short visit, controlled, polite. Seth had built a stable life in Chicago, far from the shadow of 8 Mile. "You taught me what not to do," Seth said once, not cruelly, just honestly. Les nodded. That still counts. Because it did. By 80, Les walked slower, worked less. The electronics store had changed ownership twice. Most employees had no idea who he once was. To them, he was just an elderly coworker who kept to himself and never complained. The media never came back. The public forgot. The internet moved on, but internally, something had shifted permanently. He no longer thought of himself as the fallen king. He no longer replayed the applause. He no longer argued with the past. He accepted it. One winter evening, much like the one when foreclosure papers first appeared, snow fell over Detroit again. Les sat by his small apartment window, watching the flakes blur the streetlights. 40 years building, 3 years collapsing, the rest learning. He understood now that identity built entirely on success is fragile. When success disappears, so does the self. And rebuilding a self without status is harder than building a business. From scratch, but it's possible. Not flashy. Not headline-worthy. Just honest. His life would never be a comeback story. There was no empire restored, no triumphant return to television, no final vindication. Instead, there was accountability, endurance, quiet repair of fractured relationships. Imperfect, but real. And perhaps that was the final lesson. The empire had fallen. The king had been deposed, but the man remained. Older, humbled, smaller in the world's eyes. Yet, for the first time in decades, no longer running from himself. By 82, the pace of his world had slowed to something almost gentle. He no longer worked. His body had decided that for him. The payment plan still existed, automatically withdrawing from the small social security checks and modest income adjustments arranged years earlier. There was no drama left in it. Just deduction, routine, consequence. His apartment was quiet, but no longer suffocating. Over time, he had learned the difference between loneliness and solitude. Loneliness had defined the first years after the collapse. Solitude, he discovered, was something chosen, something steadier. Ashley visited twice a year now. Not out of obligation, but not fully out of warmth either. It was something in between. Careful, measured. Healing takes time when trust has been broken at the foundation. Seth called on holidays. Short conversations. Updates about work, weather, health. They never revisited the numbers. They never needed to. The numbers were no longer the point. One afternoon, a young man knocked on his apartment door. Early 20s, nervous, holding a small notebook. "Mr. Gold?" he asked. I'm studying business. I watched hardcore porn. Growing up, I heard what happened. I just wanted to ask, what went wrong? It was the first time in years someone had asked him directly. Les could have blamed the market. He could have blamed the consultant. He could have blamed the lawsuit, the banks, the timing. Instead, he said something simpler. I stopped listening. And one day, young man frowned slightly. I stopped listening to people who warned me. I stopped listening to change. I stopped listening to doubt. When you think you're always the smartest person in the room, that's the moment you become the most vulnerable. The student wrote it down carefully. And crypto? The young man asked cautiously. Risk isn't the enemy, Les replied. Ego is. After the student left, Les sat quietly for a long time. For decades, he had been known for his confidence, for his toughness, for his ability to read value instantly. But the older he became, the clearer something else felt true. Wisdom arrives when confidence softens. His health declined gradually, not dramatically. A hospital stay here, a medication adjustment there. The body keeps score, just like finances. One evening, as spring returned to Detroit, Ashley sat beside his bed during a longer hospital visit. The machines hummed softly in the background. Do you regret everything? She asked. Not accusingly, just searching. Les thought carefully. I regret the harm, he said. Not the work. Not the ambition. Just the harm. She nodded. That answer seemed to settle something. In the final months, there were no grand speeches, no public apologies broadcast to cameras. The world had already moved on years ago. But privately, he made peace where he could. He apologized without defending himself. He listened more than he spoke. He let silence exist without filling it. And one quiet morning, as sunlight filtered through thin hospital curtains, Les Gold closed his eyes. Not as the king of porn. Not as a television personality. Not as a cautionary headline, but simply as a man who had once climbed high, fallen hard, and spent the remainder of his life carrying the weight of his own choices. The empire was gone. The reputation rewritten. The fortune erased, but in the end, what remained was something quieter. A lesson. That success without humility is temporary. That pride can bankrupt more than finances. And that sometimes the greatest reckoning isn't public ruin. It's living long enough to understand it. In the final stretch of his life, time no longer felt like something to conquer. It felt like something to sit with. Les had once measured his days in deals closed, profits made, negotiations won. Now he measured them in smaller units. Morning. Light through the blinds, the sound of traffic below his apartment window, the steady rhythm of breath that reminded him he was still here. The hospital visits became more frequent after 83. Nothing dramatic at first. Fatigue, dizziness. A heart that had spent decades racing through arguments and adrenaline now struggled with ordinary tasks. Doctors spoke gently but clearly. There would be no dramatic recovery arc, only management, maintenance, gradual decline. He accepted it with a calm that would have been impossible 20 years earlier. The strange thing about losing everything is that it removes the illusion of control. And once the illusion is gone, you stop pretending you're invincible. You stop bargaining with reality. Ashley became the primary contact at the hospital. Seth flew in occasionally when things looked serious, then returned to Chicago when stability resumed. Their presence was careful, but real. No one pretended the past hadn't happened. But no one weaponized it anymore either. One evening, Seth sat alone with him in the hospital room. The city lights outside flickered against the glass. Do you ever think about rebuilding? Seth asked quietly. Les smiled faintly. At my age? Rebuilding what? Your name, your story. My name doesn't need rebuilding, Les replied. It needs remembering accurately. That was the difference. For most of his life, he had tried to control the narrative. On television, in interviews, in business disputes, he shaped the image. Strong, sharp, always right. But the truth didn't require shaping anymore. It required owning. Over the years following the bankruptcy, small articles occasionally resurfaced online about his fall. Opinion pieces about hubris, YouTube documentaries dissecting the crypto gamble. Comment sections filled with armchair analysts who spoke with the certainty of hindsight. He no longer read them. There was no energy left for defending himself against strangers. The only audience that had ever truly mattered was his family. And slowly, imperfectly, he had begun repairing that damage, not with grand gestures, but with consistency. He showed up when Ashley invited him to small dinners. He didn't dominate conversation. He asked questions. He listened to answers. Fully. When Seth spoke about cautious investments and slow growth strategies, Les nodded without inserting his own experience as correction. He had learned something essential. Wisdom is not proven by speaking. It is demonstrated by restraint. Financially, nothing improved in any dramatic way. The payment plan continued its silent extraction. The debt would outlive him, as agreed. He found an odd comfort in that finality. There would be no final scoreboard, no last-minute reversal, just a life accounted for. Sometimes, in quiet moments, he would revisit the turning point. The crypto convention in Las Vegas, the smooth pitch, the expensive steak dinner, the intoxicating promise of being ahead of the curve. He understood now what he had felt in that moment. Fear. Fear of aging out of relevance. Fear of being seen as outdated. Fear that his children were right about modernization. He hadn't invested in cryptocurrency. He had invested in preserving his ego. That realization no longer stabbed. It settled. One afternoon, a former employee, named Teresa, the same assistant manager who had once criticized him publicly, requested to visit. The nurse hesitated before allowing it, but Les agreed immediately. She stood at the edge of his hospital bed, older now, composed. I didn't. Come to fight, she said. I know, Les replied. There was a long pause. You weren't always cruel, she said finally. But when things got bad, you chose pride over people. He closed his eyes briefly. I know. I needed you to know that, she added. I do. There was no reconciliation ceremony. No tearful embrace. Just acknowledgement. Sometimes closure isn't forgiveness. It's clarity. As winter turned to spring again, Les found himself thinking less about the empire and more about the early days, before television, before fame. The small storefront, the long hours, the thrill of earning trust one transaction at a time. Back. Then, success had felt simpler. It had been about providing for his family, building stability. Somewhere along the way, stability had turned into expansion. Expansion into legacy. Legacy into identity. And identity, when fused with business, becomes fragile. When the business collapsed, so did the self he had constructed around it. For years after the foreclosure, he had felt like a ghost of his former image. But in the quiet that followed, something unexpected had grown in its place. Not ambition. Not comeback dreams. Acceptance. He no longer introduced himself as the former owner of American Jewelry and Loan. When new nurses asked what he used to do, he simply said, I ran a shop in Detroit. There was humility in the understatement. On his 85th birthday, Ashley brought a small cake. Seth joined via video call. No cameras, no spectacle. Just 3 people in a hospital room sharing quiet space. Any advice for us? Seth asked, half smiling. Les took his time. Never gamble what you can't afford to lose, he said. And that includes trust. Ashley reached for his hand. It was thin now, veins prominent, grip weaker but steady. You know, she said, softly. For a long time, I thought losing the business was the worst thing that happened. It wasn't. He looked at her. It was losing you while you were still alive, she finished. The words hung in the air. I'm sorry, he whispered. Not as defense, not as habit, but as truth stripped of pride. I know, she replied. The heart monitors continued their steady rhythm. In his final weeks, conversations became shorter. Energy faded. Sleep came more often. There were no dramatic last requests, no hidden fortunes, no secret comeback plan tucked away in a drawer. Just memories of 8 Mile in winter, of neon lights buzzing at closing time, of arguments that felt urgent then, but small now. He understood something clearly in those fading days. Failure had been brutal, public, humiliating. But it had also forced him to confront parts of himself he would have ignored forever, had success continued uninterrupted. Success had insulated him. Failure exposed him. And exposure, painful as it was, had carved humility into him more permanently than praise ever could. On a quiet morning, sunlight stretching across the hospital floor, Seth stood on one side of the bed and Ashley on the other. There were no reporters, no spectators, no final audience. Les opened his eyes briefly. "I thought I had to win everything," he murmured. Seth leaned closer. "You don't." A faint smile touched his lips. For decades, he had believed the highest climb defined a man. But as breath grew shallow and the room grew still, he understood the truth was different. It is not the height of the climb. It is what remains when you fall. The empire had fallen completely. The fortune evaporated. The reputation rewritten by history. But at the end, there was something quieter left behind. Not wealth, not status, not a brand. Understanding. Understanding that pride can bankrupt more than accounts. That fear disguised as ambition is dangerous. That listening is strength. That humility, learned late, is still worth learning. When his breathing finally slowed into silence, there were no dramatic final words. Only the steady presence of the two people he had once nearly lost entirely. The King of Pawn had died years earlier, on a cold January morning, when foreclosure papers hit the window. But the man, flawed, humbled, accountable, had lived long enough to face what he had done. And sometimes, that is the only redemption life allows.